Hello, Thrive Nation. Welcome to the Made to Thrive Show. I'm your host, Steve Stabs, and I've got one of my health heroes on the show today. I've been listening to him for many, many years. He is a leading expert in the areas of functional medicine and ancestral health. He's a New York Times best-selling author of Unconventional Medicine and Paleo Cure. He's got an incredible podcast that I've been listening to called Revolution Health Radio. And he's been on so many media shows. It's too many to mention, other than the Joe Rogan podcast that gets millions of downloads, plus the Dr. Oz show. Welcome to the Made to Thrive show, Chris Kresser.
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's an honor to have you, and you've been a leading health hero in the natural medicine world. We share a similar sort of life. In my other life, my professional life as a doctor of Chinese medicine, I've had the privilege of practicing for over 22 years. And so it's just blessed to talk to someone who really wants to change the world with many change agents. And that's something that I want to discuss today because you've been a pioneer in the health coaching space. But before I start there, let's give us a short little summary of your backstory, your own health issues, how you got into health. And I know that's going to encourage many, many people that are going to listen to the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in my early 20s, I set off to travel around the world. I'm a surfer, lifelong surfer. And so I spent a lot of time in Indonesia. I actually spent some time in South Africa and Jeffreys Bay and Cape Town and up around Elands Bay. So got a chance to see some of the African continent, which was lovely. But I got really sick in Indonesia on an island called Sumbawa. I was staying in a little village and surfing, and there was a big kind of stagnant pool of water right next to the river mouth that cows were milling around in and defecating in. And the locals dug a trench between that stagnant pool and the river mouth. And so all of that contaminated water went out into the surf break. And a number of other people who were there surfing also got really ill. And the acute phase of that sickness passed relatively quickly. I had some antibiotics in my medical kit, took them and continued traveling for a while. But as I traveled, it became clear that, something chronic was evolving out of that acute episode. And I saw some doctors in Australia, which is, I went to after Indonesia, and they weren't able to help. And I just progressively started to get sicker and sicker. So I eventually made my way back to the States. And as you can imagine, the conventional doctors that I saw were well-intentioned, and they did their best to help me. But Western medicine is just not great with these complex chronic illnesses. And it took about a decade for me to really recover my health and make it through that experience. And during that time, I learned about a nutrient-dense diet. This was prior to paleo being really a term that was used, but I essentially through trial and error stumbled upon what we would now call a paleo diet. And I also got introduced to initially Chinese medicine. I saw an acupuncturist and doctor of Chinese medicine who helped me a lot. And then also to functional medicine, which did exist as a term at that point, but barely. This was in the 90s. So, an Institute for Functional Medicine started in the 1990s, but nobody knew about it. It was not like it is now. But it just made a lot of sense, like finding and addressing the root cause of the illness, which I knew had something to do with that experience in Indonesia and what it did to my gut and gut health, made so much more sense than just taking drugs to suppress the symptoms. So after, that experience, I decided to go back and study Chinese medicine. And during my schooling, I already knew that I was going to not practice Chinese medicine in a traditional way, that I was going to expand into functional medicine because I had already experienced it myself and learned more about it. So I was already training in functional medicine while I was in school. And then I started a practice. And within a short period of time, I recognized that there was a limit, of course, to the number of people that I could help as a solo practitioner. I saw a really strong need for more functional medicine practitioners, because not only was my practice full, I wasn't able to make referrals often because there just weren't that many functional medicine practitioners to refer to. So I back in 2016 launched a 12-month training program for functional medicine practitioners who wanted to focus on ancestral health and lifestyle and have a really practical hands-on training. And then a few years after that, through my own experience practicing functional medicine, training hundreds of providers around the world, it became clear to me that there would never be enough, and will probably never be enough, doctors or practitioners to address the healthcare epidemic that we're facing. And that in 80% of cases, it really boils down to diet, lifestyle, and behavior change that needs to happen. And you don't need a doctor or even an acupuncturist or a functional medicine practitioner of any type to help people to make those changes. And so that's when I got really interested in health coaching, because health coaches, as you mentioned, are change agents, and they're experts in helping people to make lasting changes to their diet, behavior, and lifestyle. And you can train a health coach very well in a year's time. The barriers to entry are much lower because you don't need to have a medical background. And there's something really powerful in taking people from a community, training them to be an advocate for change, and sending them back into the communities that they live in and serve. And so we launched a 12-month health coach training program in 2018. And that's both of those training programs are still active and doing very well. And that's where my passion is at this point, is training as many health coaches and practitioners as we can to go out and stem this rising tide of chronic disease.
Fantastic. And I've had the privilege of having one of your health coaches work with me, Enrique Schoch, who went through your process, the ADAPT health coaching process, and really comprehensive. And he's added such value to Made to Thrive as a Thrivist. But one of the things that we know as practitioners in my other life is that people don't maintain their transformation. And that's why I'm so interested in health coaching, to build up a health coaching practice here and put as many health coaches on the Made to Thrive website, and looking to partner with the Kresser Institute. So tell me, what are the top things that will sustain someone's transformation? People put things in place when they're six months later, sometimes 3 months later, sometimes 3 years later, they're back to their old ways. They don't maintain their transformation and they slip back into old habits. Tell us, what do you think your top 3 or top 5 sort of hacks or lifestyle changes can maintain people's sustained transformation?
Yeah, I think there are lots of reasons that people either don't change in the first place, or do change and then, as you said, change back or revert to an unhealthy pattern of behavior. One of them is ambivalence. And so it's a word that has a particular meaning in the context that we're talking about now. And what it means is that you have just as many reasons for not changing or not engaging in the healthy behavior as you do for changing or engaging in a healthy behavior. And so let me use an example. It would be, imagine a mother of 3 kids who is working outside the home and as well as inside the home, and is really wants to go to bed earlier and get more sleep. But she also is busy the entire day, pretty much from the time she wakes up with her kids, getting them off to school, and then she goes to work outside of the home herself, and then she comes home, she's cooking dinner and getting the kids to bed and dealing with all of that stuff. Late at night is really the only time she has for herself, and the only time that she could catch up on personal emails and get some stuff done that she wants to get done. And so that's what leads her to stay up late and not get to bed early. And those are actually really legitimate reasons to stay up.
Yeah.
And if she doesn't understand those reasons or identify them and then find other solutions or other ways of getting those needs met, there's going to be that tension or that ambivalence between knowing that she needs to get to bed earlier and for her health and well-being, but also having these other needs that have to be met. And so one thing that a health coach can do in that situation is, first of all, help her to identify that ambivalence, be aware of it, be aware of those other needs that are legitimate and have to be met, and then to help her to create her own strategies for meeting those other needs that might not involve staying up late and interfering with her sleep. So I think that's one example of how this can play out. But whether you're talking about diet or stopping smoking or any number of other behavior changes, there's almost always that ambivalence, that just as many reasons for not changing as for changing. And so becoming aware of those is really important. Another key factor I would say is motivation for change. So this is something that health coaches learn to get at through a technique called motivational interviewing, which is actually came out of the addiction, people who work with addiction, whether it's to smoking cigarettes or alcohol or whatever. We often assume that we know what people's motivation for change is or should be. So for example, let's imagine someone who has developing type 2 diabetes. They're pre-diabetic, or maybe they're at the very early stages of diabetes. And as a practitioner, or even as a health coach who doesn't have this training, we might just assume that they have the motivation to change just based on their own health and well-being. Like, hey, look, you're developing diabetes. This is going to shorten your lifespan. It could lead to really nasty complications like blindness or peripheral neuropathy, and you're heading down a path. And shouldn't that be enough for that person to make that change? It was for me, it was for my friend, so it must be for this other person. But as it turns out, that may not be enough of a motivation for that person for whatever reason. And in talking to them, however, you might learn that they have their first grandchild was just born, and they're really excited about being a grandparent. And the thing that bothers them the most is the idea that they might not be able to play with their grandkids because they're crippled by this disease, or because they're just so unwell that they're not able to do it. And so it might be that tapping into that motivation to change is far better strategy than trying to beat them over the head with the idea that they should eat better, exercise more for their own health and well-being. So that's something that would be uncovered in, using something like motivational interviewing to help the client or the patient to discover their own motivation and strategies for change, rather than imposing our idea as the expert in terms of how they should change. And then a third principle is just that, as I'm sure most people have heard, there's a lot of popular books out on this topic, but it takes time to develop habits, and it takes consistency, and there are lots of different hacks or practices that we can use to more effectively develop those habits. And this is something also that a good health coach would be trained to do. But just as an example, one would be habit stacking. So let's say I want to develop a meditation practice. If I stack this new desired habit closely with a habit that is already well established, let's say brushing my teeth. I brush my teeth in the morning, and also before bed. So one strategy would be, when I finish brushing my teeth in the morning, I will sit down on my meditation cushion and meditate. And that's much easier to do than to just kind of randomly choose a time every day to meditate. When you stack a habit onto one that already exists, you're much more likely to be successful. Another kind of similar strategy would be, if you're trying to develop a new habit, going back to what we talked about is understanding motivation. So understanding what the motivation is for that habit, and getting clear on why you want to develop that habit, your own needs and desires for building that habit, which is very different than I should do this because it's good for me.
Mm.
We all as human beings, for whatever reason, have an aversion to being told what to do. And so if we can really identify our own clear motivation for what we're doing and shift that from something that we should do because it's good for us or whatever to something that we want to do because it's life affirming and it's going to make our life better, then that's also a powerful strategy.
Fantastic. And it reminds me of my two favorite books, BJ Fogg's book, Tiny Habits, and then Atomic Habits by James Clear. And those are two books that really I dove into last year that were really, really empowering amongst the sort of Corona coasted times, just to stack these habits and change life, because obviously our thoughts become actions, our actions become habits, hopefully, and that determines our lifestyle. So it sounds like these health coaches are incredible. Many South Africans or Africans might know about executive coaching or business coaching, which I've done over many, many years to coach execs in that. But Chris, can you tell us in your own simple words, and I know your principles on your website that maybe you want to go into, what is health coaching?
Well, a health coach is an ally or a guide. You can think of them as a powerful advocate for change and transformation. And it's the easiest way to talk about health coaching in some sense is how it's different than what we typically experience when we interact with a practitioner or a doctor or someone like that. So a doctor or practitioner typically uses what we call the expert approach. So they're the authority, they have the expertise, the information, they deliver that, and the expectation is that you will just act on that because it's the guidance that's offered by the expert. It's not a collaborative process. It's not a generative process. It's really a process. It's hierarchical and in some ways autocratic. And it may sound like I'm disparaging this approach, but I'm actually not. There's a time and a place for the expert approach. So, for example, in many cases, if someone might be, let's say they're diagnosed with cancer or another disease, they want to get information about it. They want an expert opinion. They want someone who knows how to interpret a test result and tell them what that means for their health and maybe what they should, give them some options for what to do about it. So there's definitely a time and a place for that approach. However, when it comes to behavior and lifestyle change, there's the decades now of research that show that is not the expert approach, is not what's effective in terms of leading to lasting transformation, which we've been discussing all along. And that's where health coaching comes in. So in contrast to the expert approach, we might call health coaching the ally or guide approach. So, a guide does more listening than talking, for example. They ask more questions than provide answers. They help the client to discover their own motivation or strategies for change rather than giving them a motivation or telling them why they should change and telling them how to change. It's a very collaborative process, as I mentioned before. It's more like I'm walking alongside of you than I'm, on a pedestal above you, or I'm setting myself up as somehow apart from you and separate from you. And so really the goal of a health coach is to become a change agent, an agent of creating whatever the changes are that the client is interested in. And that could be a pretty broad range of stuff. It could be, what we might typically think of as like improving diet or, getting more exercise or getting more sleep. But increasingly in the world that we live in today, it's helping to reduce distractions and, shift your relationship with technology so that, smartphones and social media and things like that aren't completely taking over somebody's life and interfering with their health. That's a growing concern for many people. It could be cultivating more pleasure and fun in life. For a lot of people, the modern industrial world has become kind of drudgery, where it's just work, getting kids off to school, you know, dishes, meal preparation,
Yeah.
do all of the kind of obligations of life. And we've forgotten how important pleasure and connecting with other people and spending time outdoors and these things that tend to kind of get relegated to, like, if I'll do them if only if I have a few minutes during the day or over the weekend. So it's improving quality of life, we could say, as a kind of general catchphrase there. And even things that some people might consider more spiritual questions, or at least not necessarily strictly in the realm of health, but I firmly believe that they are. And that would be finding purpose in life and cultivating more meaning in what we do. And that can be both big and small, like finding more meaning in just the day-to-day interactions that we have and things that we do in our life, and also larger purpose. Like, for example, I recently talked to one of our health coach grads that told me that it's not unusual for their clients to call them and talk to them about big life decisions. That, like one of his clients was thinking about leaving his job, which he really didn't like and hadn't liked for some time, and because he recognized that staying in a job that he hated was damaging to his health and well-being. And you might not think that falls strictly under the domain of health coaching, but it absolutely does. And I think what health coaches find is that a lot of their clients have never had somebody in their life that was just held them in what Carl Rogers, the psychologist, calls unconditional positive regard, that has no agenda other than supporting them and helping them to achieve their goals. And when you have someone like that in your life, you're not just going to limit yourself to talking about diet and sleep. You'll probably bring a lot of other things into that conversation or relationship that have an impact on health. So, we have coaches who are taking this work into so many different domains. For example, we have a health coach who is working in Tonga with the Tongan population there that has a very, very high incidence of diabetes and obesity. We have a health coach that was a longtime social activist herself, but got really burned out and now wants to take health coaching back to her social activist community so they can learn to recharge their batteries and continue to have the impact that they're having. We have health coaches that have gone on to start health related companies. So they're not specifically necessarily even working one-on-one with people, but they've taken the skills that they've learned in health coaching and they've gone on to do, launch entrepreneurial ventures in the healthcare space. So there's so many different applications for how health coaching can kind of be disseminated in the world, which is one of the reasons I think it's so powerful.
Fantastic. Possibly you can give a sort of a very quick layman's explanation of what functional medicine is for the audience that doesn't know about that. Secondly, should a health coach sort of become affiliated with an integrative medical doctor or practitioner? Because I'm part of the South African Society of Integrative Medicine. And it just seems that there's not much uptake with health coaches, especially because there's no standardization. Someone does a weekend course, calls himself a health coach. How do you think you can sort of grow health coaching in South Africa? And I know there's a lot of questions there, but it's just really difficult for a lot of the health coaches in South Africa, those that have done an extensive course for a year. There's no standardization, someone who's done a weekend course. What should the health coaches be doing out there, and what type of training do they need?
So the first question about functional medicine is, it's really a systems-based approach to health and disease that focuses on identifying and addressing the root cause of illness rather than just suppressing symptoms. So in the conventional approach to chronic disease, you basically wait until it has already occurred, and then you prescribe drugs or sometimes even do surgery in order to deal with the manifestations of chronic disease. So an example would be high cholesterol or high blood pressure. So most people know if they go into the doctor, they get a test and they have high cholesterol or high blood pressure, they'll simply be prescribed a drug to lower those. And if they ask the doctor how long they'll need to take those drugs, the answer is usually for the rest of your life. In functional medicine model, if you go in and we test you and you have high cholesterol or high blood pressure, we'll ask why. Why is your cholesterol high? Why is your blood pressure high? We might do some additional testing to answer that question. We'll, of course, ask you about your diet. We'll ask you about your exercise, your stress management, all of those things. And we'll try to address those factors and bring down your cholesterol or your blood pressure without medication first, by addressing those root causes. And it's not to say that we never will use medication. There's sometimes is a need for medication, but it's rarely the first thing that is needed because medications rarely address root causes. So that's functional medicine in a nutshell. As to your second question, there are a number of different answers. The first is that, yes, in our program, the ADAPT Health Coach Training Program, and we also, as I mentioned before, train practitioners. So we have the ADAPT Practitioner Training Program. I've always advocated what I call a collaborative model of healthcare. So this involves teaming up healthcare practitioners. So that could be a medical doctor, it could be a nurse practitioner, physician assistant, acupuncturist, chiropractor, naturopath, whatever the licensed professional is, with a team of care providers that can work to the best of their scope of practice and background and training in providing the highest level of care possible for the patient. So one phrase I like to use is healthcare is a team sport, and I really believe that that's true. So the way that that might look is, the practitioner does the testing and interprets those test results and establishes the treatment plan. But that doesn't leave much time for actually helping the patient to implement that treatment plan. So the patient might, the practitioner might recommend a paleo diet or perhaps a ketogenic diet because the patient has diabetes, but the patient is totally overwhelmed by that, doesn't know what that means, doesn't know how to eat. So, a registered dietitian or a certified nutrition specialist or nutritionist could help fill in that gap and provide the information that that patient needs in order to follow through with that diet. But there's still a huge piece missing, which is, okay, I've got all this information. I know what I should do, but I'm far from that now. And how does that fit in with my life? Wait, my husband's not on this diet and my kids aren't, and I don't know how to go shopping for this. I don't know what meals to make. I don't know how I'm going to do this. I'm totally overwhelmed. Help. That's where the health coach comes in, is, helping to implement those recommendations that were made by the practitioner and the nutritionist and make sure that the patient is successful in achieving their goals. So when you have that kind of team approach, it can be extremely effective. And I do think that's the future of medicine in general and of health coaching in particular, is that kind of collaboration. And that can happen in different ways. The health coach could be an employee, like it sounds like it may be the case in your situation, Steve, or the health coach could be a solo practitioner, have their own practice and just connect with a number of different practitioners and get, and so be a part of different care teams, or somewhere in between. They could be an independent contractor that works for a clinic and also has their own practice on the side. So there's different ways of doing it. In terms of the future of health coaching and some of the issues that we're facing now with standardization and recognition in the marketplace and things like that, I think it's important to understand that we're still in really early days with health coaching as a profession. Up until recently, it was kind of the Wild West, as you pointed out. You could just print health coach on your business card and voila, you're a health coach. You don't even need to take a weekend course. You could just print it on your business card and you would be a health coach. And that's still true in the sense that there's no, licensing board that regulates that as there is with medical doctors, for example. I mean, if you put medical doctor on your business card and start promoting yourself as a medical doctor and you're not trained as a medical doctor, you're probably going to get a phone call from the medical board at some point. And we don't have that with health coaching yet. It may happen at some point. But what we do have now over the last few years is a step in the right direction, which is in the US, there's an organization called the National Board of Health and Wellness Coaches. And they have teamed up with the National Board of Medical Examiners, which actually is the same organization that determines the educational and training standards for medical doctors and also for medical specialties. So, for example, if you want to become a gastroenterologist, you have to, do additional training and education in order to achieve that board certification. And the National Board of Medical Examiners is actually the group that determines what those additional steps are. So it's a very legitimate, well-established organization. And the fact that they have now teamed up with a National Board of Health and Wellness Coaching to create those same level of standard for training and education of health coaching is a really, really positive sign. And so coaches who want to achieve that highest level of training go for that national board certification credential. And even though it's a US based organization, it's now recognized as being the highest level of training that you can get as a health coach anywhere in the world. In other words, there are no other organizations in other countries that have kind of come forward and created standards that surpass the National Board of Health and Wellness Coaching. And it's kind of similar in medicine, where like if you're trained as a doctor in the US, you can pretty much go to any other country in that training. You'll have to pass whatever, licensing standards they have, but it's recognized that the training that you got in the US is at a level that is at least equal to, if not surpassing, what's available in the local country. So I think it's a similar kind of thing with health coaching now. And another really positive development, and one that could be a total game changer for coaching, at least in the US, and I would expect eventually in other places in the world, and I'll come back to that, is the American Medical Association recently created a level 3 CPT code for health coaching. So what that means in the US, CPT code is a code that doctors or practitioners use when they have an encounter with patients to classify essentially what they're doing. And a level 1 CPT code is a billable or reimbursable code. So if a doctor prescribes something and they enter a CPT code that's level 1, it means the insurance company, whether it's Medicare, our version of public healthcare, or whether it's a private insurance company like Blue Cross or Blue Shield, they will then reimburse the patient for that service. So a level 3 code is not yet reimbursable, but it's viewed as the first step towards that reimbursable code, and it's used for research purposes. So practitioners like you or me could put that code in, and then we could track the progress of the health coaching intervention. And over time, once there's enough research supporting the efficacy of health coaching using this code, the idea is that it will move to a level 1 code, and health coaching will become a reimbursable service in the United States, whether it's through Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance plans. And I know that similar thing is happening with the NHS in the UK. They have recently recognized health coaching, and I believe may even be starting to pay for some of the services. It's a little murky still what's happening there, but the point here is that the trend is very positive towards health coaching not only becoming recognized as a legitimate profession and intervention in its own right, and then through like national boards certification and standardization of training, but also actually being integrated into existing healthcare systems. And ironically, I think that's gonna happen much more quickly than with functional medicine. And I say ironically because functional medicine's been around for 25 years, and we've been chipping away at trying to get this integration. Mark Hyman's efforts at the Cleveland Clinic for Center for Functional Medicine, the research that they're doing, all tremendous efforts, but have not made nearly the same level of progress that health coaching has made in just a few short years. So I think we'll see health coaching integrated into the conventional healthcare system before we will see functional medicine integrated into the conventional system.
Wow, that's quite a statement to make. And obviously functional medicine been around for a long time. I had Dr. Jeffrey Bland on the podcast as well, giving us the history. functional medicine with Dr. Mark Hyman, and they really put a lot of effort, time, and energy to train doctors and medical practitioners. So I'm excited because I do believe that the system, looking at chronic disease in the States, you've got an incredible sort of stat on your website saying that literally like 6% of only Americans, participate in the 5 most healthy sort of activities. That's huge. So basically 94, 95% or whatever it is still engaging in unhelpful activities in terms of their health and the well-being. So that's huge. Tell us a little bit more about health coaching and your personal research. I know we're going to get the CPT code at a later stage. How different does a patient respond or a client respond when they've got a functional medicine doctor that's working with a health coach and the patient or the client embraces that health coach? Tell us about your personal experience of the many, many years. What are the differences between the coached and the uncoached?
Yeah, it's a big difference. There are always going to be a small percentage of people who don't need coaching. These are the highly self-motivated folks. They're the 6% you mentioned, that they're already doing the right things. And they're just that type of personality that doesn't need the external support and accountability in order to follow through with their own health goals or whatever their practitioner tells them. So, but that's the extreme minority. We know from the
Exactly.
statistic that you just mentioned that's probably around 5% of the US population, and I suspect that it's even lower than that, because that 5% was just engaging in the top 5 like basic health behaviors. They're not necessarily doing everything right. They're just not smoking, not drinking excessively, maintaining a healthy weight, and doing a few other things that are just what I would consider to be the basics. So for the other 95%, we know that behavior change is hard. And there are lots of reasons for that. There are evolutionary reasons for that. We have biologically, our brains are wired to live in a different environment than we live in today. So one example would be our brains are programmed to seek out highly calorie dense, rewarding foods. And when I say rewarding, I mean, that's a psychological term that when we eat something that's rewarding, we want to eat more of it. So we're programmed to seek out salty, sugary, fatty foods because that programming actually helped us to survive in an environment where food scarcity was a much bigger problem than food abundance. If our distant ancestors living in the Paleolithic era, if they discovered a beehive with honey, they would eat as much of that as they possibly could because they had no idea when they were going to encounter that again. And that would actually help them to survive in that type of environment. But when you've got convenience stores on every corner and fast food restaurants on every corner, that drive to seek out that, very calorie dense, rewarding food backfires. So that's just one example of how in the modern world, we're kind of fighting against our default evolutionary programming that, while it protected us and helped us survive in our ancestral environment, it actually works against us now. And that's very powerful programming. We're talking about stuff that's below the level of conscious thought, and it's just always operating in the background. And it's really difficult to work with that. So, people who have support of a health coach are much more able to recognize the influence of those factors on their behavior and the choices they make, and they're much more able to overcome those obstacles and challenges. So, and there are many other challenges too, just in terms of the way most of us are living now. Like I said before, a lot of folks are really busy. They have lots of other obligations in their life, family, work, childcare, personal stuff going on. And a health coach just having someone to, again, be their ally and their advocate, someone who has no other agenda than helping them to succeed, is such a powerful role. And so the people who have embraced that and have really worked with the health coach, what the feedback that we get is they can't even imagine, doing what they're doing without that support, because it just becomes such an essential part of the process. To your point, I think we still have some education to do in terms of helping people to understand the role of a health coach, especially early on. We would see people. I think part of it is I don't know how it is in South Africa. I mean, I've traveled there, but you could tell me more. In the US, we have this very strong individualist ethos, right? Where if I need help or support, that means that I'm weak or there's something wrong with me, or I should be able to do it on my own. There's that very strong ethos here in the U.S. and we've had a number of patients early on, not elect to get health coaching because I think they thought that they could or should be able to do it on their own. And then, we wouldn't see them for 6 months. They would come back and we'd say, what happened? And they'd say, oh, I totally fell off the wagon. I started out with good intentions and then I stopped. And, so that there's still an education process that needs to happen there, and maybe a shifting in some of that understanding that seeking out the support of a health coach is not anything to be ashamed of. It doesn't mean something's wrong with you or that you failed in any way. It's just actually what the shift that we're trying to create is helping people to understand that as a super smart way to leverage support, and to outsmart the forces that are working against them achieving their goals. So turn it into a positive rather than a negative.
Fantastic. And when I interviewed James Maskell from the Community Cure, his amazing statement that Dr. Harmon said, it takes community is the greatest force to bring about change. Tell us about how a health coach can sort of form a community. People go back into their communities where other people have like bad lifestyle habits with regards to diet or exercise or junk light. How important is community in terms of sustained change?
Yeah, I think it's vital. I agree with James, and Mark is a great friend of mine, and we see eye to eye on that for sure. Um, that's another, I think, consequence of modern life in the industrialized world is separation from community. For the vast majority of evolutionary history, humans lived in tight-knit tribal groups of maybe about 100 to maximum 150 people. We had strong relationships with those people, the in-person relationships, not via digital technologies or social media. And that those deep relationships and that deep sense of place and belonging made us feel like we weren't alone, and that if any illness happened, there was a support there within that tribal system. So regardless of whether what we think of the specific approaches that they might have taken, shamanism or natural medicine, whatever people think about that, the fact is that when someone was sick or needed help, there were other people there to provide that support. Maybe a family member to cook and provide meals, or to provide other types of care, and other people in the village to help out with childcare. There was just a much richer network of that kind of support. And one of the things that I'm most excited about with health coaching is seeing the potential for that, rebuilding that type of community. I mentioned before some of the examples of how health coaching is being taken back into local communities, with the gentleman who's working in Tonga, and the social activists. We also have in this current cohort a woman, African woman actually, who's living in the UK, who lives in an underserved community in the UK where obesity and diabetes are quite rampant. And you often do see this in immigrant communities that move from their traditional place of origin, let's say rural Africa, to a city, and their health tends to suffer much more dramatically than people who have been habituated to living in cities for many, many generations. And so for her, in talking to her, she said the awareness of all this stuff that we've been talking about, ancestral health, paleo diet, functional medicine, is very low. And so she's excited about bringing that work back into her community. There are lots of people and lots of students in the program. We actually have something called the Trailblazers Grant Program, where we provide grants for people from underserved communities who are specifically going to take the work back into their community in some way. So we have a wide range of examples of how that's happening. And, from women who've been abused, for example, to, people of color, in various situations, prisoners to, who've gotten out of prison and who, are trying to reduce recidivism and, reduce the likelihood of going back to prison. But I think the important thing in all of these threads is that the person who's doing the work is a person who is coming from that community.
That's
And
right.
this is different than again, the patriarchal kind of expert approach of like, I, who am not part of your community, am going to come in and tell you what you need to do, in your community. And that, we just know that that doesn't work very well in terms of social change or behavior change. And health coaching can provide the ability for people from these communities to get trained, to be powerful change agents, and then to take that work back to their community. So that's
Wow.
one of the things I'm most excited about.
Wow, just listening to you, I just overwhelmed with emotion, because you're a man who's authentic, who really cares, who wants to transform the world, and realizes he can't do it with his own personal body or even the functional doctors that you're training. And so, well done to you. I salute you and thank you. We're going to be partnering with the Kresser Institute for the Made to Thrive audience that's listening, or the viewership on our YouTube channel, because it's the most extensive health coaching program that I've investigated and researched over many, many years. I've got firsthand experience with one of the health coaches on the Made to Thrive website, Ricky Schoch. So I just thank you so much. I think it's going to just grow and exponentially change so many people's lives. And I think you talk about meaning and purpose, Chris, and I thank you so much. And you've come up against a lot of resistance, and we don't have time to get into that, but your incredible debate with Dr. Khan and the Joe Rogan Experience was fantastic. I love what your website says: evidence-based health answers you can trust. And that's absolutely fantastic. I did get a lot of questions. We are going to be partnering with the Kresser Institute. There will be a discount for those that want to become health coaches through the Adapt Coaching program, and that'll be in the show notes. It'll be on our special deals part of our website. So for those listening or those who want to get involved, please go and have a look there. We'll be loading it up pretty soon, and we'll be putting the links on our website as well as on the show notes of this podcast. Thank you so much. I did get quite a few questions from my inner circle, knowing that I was going to have you on. So I'm just going to take the last few minutes and get you to answer those as best as you can, keeping it pretty short, because I had Stephanie Seneff, Dr. Stephanie Seneff on the podcast, talking about glyphosate, how important it is to eat organically, grass-fed, grass-finished meat. In your opinion, if someone cannot afford organic vegetables, fruit, or grass-fed or grass-finished meat produce, is it still worth them eating meat or not, even if they're going to be eating conventional sort of meat that's raised, obviously with a GMO, obviously with, all the antibiotics, obviously with all the glyphosate? What would you say to someone who cannot afford organic produce?
Yeah. So in terms of produce, there's the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen, which is published by the Environmental Working Group in the United States. So that talks about the types of fruits and vegetables that even when they're not organic, they're pretty clean. That's the Clean 15. They're relatively low in pesticide residue and other things that you want to avoid. And then the Dirty Dozen are the 12 fruits and vegetables that you really do probably want to minimize your intake of if you're eating conventionally, because they tend to soak up more pesticide residue and other things that we want to avoid. So I often will refer people to that as a way of getting a better sense of what's safe and not safe to eat when you're eating conventional produce. When it comes to animal products, so one thing would be like there are ways of buying meat that are cheaper than going to the store and buying a New York steak, for example. So buying in bulk, finding a local farmer, that's increasingly possible in many different places, where you could buy a quarter of a cow, for example, and you could go in with a couple of other families, and that if you buy it directly from the farmer, that often dramatically reduces the price to basically the same level as conventional meat that you would buy in the store. Another thing is to choose the cheaper cuts of meat. So like chuck roast or oxtail or shanks or things like that tend to be cheaper than, certainly like a filet or a New York steak or a ribeye steak or something like that. And the added benefit to doing that is those cuts of meat have more collagen. And if you're eating organ meats like liver, they're even more nutrient dense than the muscle meats themselves. So that's a strategy that I would explore as well. And then what type of meat you're eating will make a difference too. So I think, for example, that beef, especially in a lot of countries, again, I'm not as familiar with South Africa, but in a lot of countries, even conventional beef is mostly grass fed. And it's only in the final stage of the production process that they eat grains to gain a little bit of extra weight and marble the beef. And so in that situation, I would say that conventional beef is a better choice than conventional chicken, because chickens that are raised conventionally are raised in pretty horrific circumstances, and it's not nearly as clean or as healthy as a meat as beef in that scenario. And then you could also think about game like venison and other types of wild game that you can increasingly find in the store that are not industrially produced and farmed. So I think if you get a little bit creative, there are ways of approaching that problem.
Fantastic. There's a strong meme that I've sort of developed over the last 5 years about your light diet, and that your light diet is as important as your food diet, staying away from junk light and artificial light sources, and making sure that you get sunshine and real light, and getting outside as much as you can. Tell us about your perspective of how important is your light diet compared to your food diet?
I think it's hugely important. And it goes back to our ancestral heritage where we mostly lived outdoors and we are exposed to natural light for a lot of the day. And then at nighttime, it got dark and we didn't have artificial or electric lights. So anything that departs from that, what we were used to for thousands of generations is something to be suspicious of. Now, of course, we've had lots of benefits from electric light and exposure to other types of light, but we have to balance those benefits with the very real consequences and costs of that exposure. So I think, just getting outside and spending some time in natural light every day is really important. I think minimizing your exposure to artificial light at night, particularly from blue light that's emitted from digital devices like smartphones or tablets or computers, because they can interfere with melatonin production and other hormone production is really critical. And then, exposure to sunlight for vitamin D production is very important as well. And we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, there are, hundreds of studies now that show a relationship between vitamin D levels and the initial incidence of COVID-19 infection, and then the severity of the disease once somebody is infected, that is associated with vitamin D levels. So that's just another important and very timely reason to get that exposure to sunlight.
Fantastic. Just a quick one. There's been a lot of discrepancy on the levels, optimal levels of vitamin D. I've asked a lot of practitioners. We recommend a 60 ng per ml, around there. What is Chris Kresser's view on the level of vitamin D that's really, really optimal, not just adequate?
Yeah, it turns out to be a very complex question. I would say 40 to 60. 40 to 60 is a range for most people. But what we know now, and I just did a presentation on this vitamin D and its relationship to COVID-19 at UCSF back in March, virtually, is that the idea that there's a single range that should apply to everybody is probably false, and that a lot of vitamin D researchers are now advocating for what they call the personal vitamin D response, which means that because of differences genetically, nutrient status, et cetera, and how we convert less active form of vitamin D, which is 25 D, to the more active form, 125 D, you could have, for example, Steve, a level of 30, and you could be fine. You could have adequate levels of biological active D activity. Whereas if I had a level of 30, I might be deficient biologically in vitamin D. And so just looking at 25D is only kind of the tip of the iceberg. And, we're evolving a more nuanced approach where we look at parathyroid hormone, 125D levels, and other factors to determine what the best vitamin D is for people. But since we're not there yet, and a lot of practitioners, besides yourself, are not trained to do that, then I would just say targeting a range of 40 to 60. On the higher end of that range, if you're overweight or obese, because we know that, or if you have any other health conditions, because we know that those conditions can actually reduce the conversion of 25D to the active form, 125D.
Fantastic. And last question, my top biohacks are the Aura Ring from an assessment and evaluation point of view. I don't use it much anymore because, again, a lot of sort of data for me in the beginning, and I've started to feel it in my own body. The second is Sauna Space's infrared sauna that has been incredible from a photobiomodulation point of view. Tell us about your top 2 or top 3 biohacks that have moved the needle most in Chris Kresser and Chris Kresser's clients and patients.
Yeah, I would put Sauna Space on that list for sure. I was an early adopter of that technology and a regular user still. I've got one. I also have even a sauna. I don't know if you'll be able to see it here. Probably doesn't come through because I have a virtual background. You could just see the edge popping in. Oh, there it is. This is a Sauna Space bulb. That is mounted to my desk so I can get some photobiomodulation even throughout the day while I'm working without actually going into the sauna. I think the Aura Ring can also be good as a start. As you mentioned, I don't wear it myself because I know what it's going to say in the morning. But for people who are less accustomed to paying that kind of attention and are less have less experience paying attention to the things that affect their biorhythms and their sleep, I think it's an excellent way of getting into that. I think the Apple Watch is going to be increasingly interesting as a device. I don't know if you saw this, Steve, but Apple just released that it will be tracking blood glucose and blood pressure, and also even blood alcohol levels it will be able to track, which I'm less interested in personally. I don't have a need for that, but having an ability for a watch to be able to track glucose and blood pressure is very interesting to me as a practitioner. And already, I don't use the watch I don't use really many apps on the watch, but it can be really helpful for like there's the Breathe app on the watch, for example, can just vibrate gently, and you can use that as a reminder to bring your attention back to the present moment and do what it could be breathing or it could be whatever you do to center yourself. I also use it as a dictation device. So if think of something that comes up, this is more along the lines of productivity, but I think it crosses the line with health too, because it helps me to really just keep my head clear and pay attention to what I really need to be focusing on. So I think the watch is already quite useful from a health perspective, but is just going to get more and more useful as time goes on. The last thing I'll say about that is I do appreciate a lot of these devices and the impact that they can have, but I'm a little bit skeptical of the biohacking movement in general, because what I often see happening is excessive focus on hacks and not enough focus on just the basics, which I think for the vast majority of people have a far greater effect in terms of improving their health and the quality of their life than, having, all of the latest gadgets and technologies. So that's just my personal bias for myself and for my patients. And again, I'm no Luddite. I like these technologies. I think they have a role to play, but not if they get in the way of adequate attention to the basics.
Yeah, thank you so much. And what a privilege, what an honor to have Chris Kresser on the Made to Thrive show, a real, true health pioneer with years and years of wisdom. And he's just pioneering the health coaching space and the health advocate space and the community visits. So thank you so much. We look forward to partnering with you. And we wish you the best, because you are the true form of doctor. The Made to Thrive community knows that the word doctor comes from the Latin docere, which means to teach. We got to teach the new children. We got to teach our teenagers, our adolescents. We got to teach the new generations, the millennials. Everybody needs to be taught. Everybody needs to take accountability of their health. So thank you so much, Chris. We wish you all the best.
Well, thank you, Steve. We can't do this without you. You're a great embodiment of the model that I've been advocating, this collaborative model where, practitioners work with coaches and build their communities and contribute to their communities. So appreciate you and all the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.